I am fresh out of ideas for clever introductions, so here's the video pitch. The Moon Sisters are part of a Loom that's actually a dragon computer that went boom. That's it, that's the whole pitch. And before you ask any questions or sink further into the depths of confusion, I will remind you that there are timestamps, spoiler warning, citations, attributions, and links to related content in the description box, while post-video notes and corrections can be found in the pinned comment. So okay, let's break down this mess of a statement I just made, starting with identifying the role of the moon goddesses, sisters, or whatever you want to call them. And then we'll start layering in the rest of the ideas. Okay, so according to the teaser videos, the three Moon Sisters once ruled over Teyvat. Now, technically we've known this since the very start of the game. I'm talking all the way back into 1.0. Although back then and up until now, we've always known these moon goddesses as Aria, Sonnet, and Canon, but in the teaser, they're called the Eternal, Iridescent, and Frost Moons. If you ask me, I think the Eternal Moon is Canon because Kanon is a goddess that the omnipresent god in Inazuma is based off of, and the Archon of the region, A, not only has a crap ton of moon symbolism everywhere throughout her kit and in her lore, but she also has the ideal of eternity, hence Eternal Moon Canon. And one day I will make that theory that A is a dragon moon fragment hiding in a puppet body that Makoto made, but it's not gonna be today because we've got way too much to get through. Now, since we can connect Canon to the Eternal Moon, it's probably likely that we can connect the other moons to the other two Moon Sisters. And I think that Aria is the iridescent moon because that's the one that became the Crimson Moon, presumably. And in other Hoyoverse titles like Hokkai Gakuen 2, there is a character named Alaya, a name that can also be pronounced as Aria, who is also a biocomputer that resets the world from time to time and is therefore the harbinger of calamity, just like the Crimson Moon in Genshin is. And Process of Elimination leaves us with Sonnet as the Frost Moon. I don't really have much to say about them yet. Now, the purpose or role of the Moon Sisters has never really been explicitly stated in-game or in teasers, but we can use all of these little bits of information that's found in-game to make a pretty good approximation of not only what position the Moon Goddesses had within the scope of Teyvat's operations, but also where their fall or disappearance happened within the timeline. Let's start with the timeline. So we know that we were down to 1 moon out of 3 during the Archon War because characters like Deshret talk about how there's supposed to be 3 moons in the sky, but there aren't 3 moons in the sky, which means that the moons must have fallen prior to the Archon War. And according to multiple legends that are found in the records of Jueyun and the Moonlit Bamboo Forest, among others, we know that both the moons and the Seelies fell to the same disaster. So we're looking for a catastrophe that happened before the Archon War, but most likely after the Dragon War. And I say that because we know that the original mandate of the Seelies was to guide primitive humans, which means that both the moons and the Seelies were last seen during an era where there were a lot of humans, and that could only be after the Dragon War. So the civilization that existed after the Dragon War was the Unified Civilization, the first era of humanity, and this just so happens to precede the Archon War. But if both the moons and the Seelies were around during the era of humanity, that means they must have reported to the First Ascender, aka the primordial one, the one who defeated the dragons in the Dragon War. Because the First Ascender is the one who brought humans into Teyvat. Allegedly. So it would make sense then that the disaster that took out the moons, Seelies, and early human civilization was the Great War of Vengeance, the war that was presumably led by surviving dragons who wanted revenge against the First Ascender since, you know, they kinda took over the planet. This War of Vengeance also could have marked the return of the Dragon King Nibelung after his disappearance during the First War, but it's kinda hard to say. We don't really have a lot of good records around this, but there are a couple of things that we do know about this war. First, it was described as invaders coming from beyond the firmament, and those invaders appear to have been abyssal invaders. And these invaders brought with them a lot of abyssal energy that flooded the world and kind of destroyed everything, and the only way they could stop the destruction was for the First Ascender to toss down a bunch of celestial nails to purify and stabilize everything. Now, while this war wasn't successful, the abyssal invaders did manage to ruin the functions of the usurper, which did make them unable to wield their absolute authority over the land. Now, obviously, this line from Nouvelette's character story, which is where this piece of information comes from, is not very clear as to what it means for the First Descender's authority to have its functions ruined. It could mean that they've had their powers sealed like the Traveler, but it could also mean something else entirely. And what might that be, you might ask? Well, when I think about the ultimate power of authority in Teyvat, I think about the heavenly principles, especially since this phrase is often equated to the First Descender as if it's one of their titles or something. Although I don't think the Heavenly Principles is a title for the first Descender. See, the concept of the Heavenly Principles is one taken from Confucianism, and this philosophy was one shared by many Chinese religions. But it doesn't refer to a single person, god, or deity. It's simply what you call the system of laws that governs the world, which also makes it the source of divine authority. Now, in some religions, there is an entity that issues those laws and others that help enforce them, but they are not the laws themselves, and that's kind of important here. So if the first Descender lost their function of ultimate authority over the world, then this must refer to their loss of control over the Heavenly Principles, since that is Teyvat's divine authority. So let me ask you this. If both the Heavenly Principles and the moons broke or fell at the same time, is it not reasonable to assume that the Heavenly Principles are related directly to the moons? I think it is, especially if we roll with the assumption we made earlier about how the moons were potentially working for, or at least allied with, the first Descender, given how they were friendly with the Seelies who oversaw early humankind, and humankind was precious to the first Descender. So in light of all that, I think the real question here is, what exactly are these laws that are governing over Teyvat, and how exactly do they relate to the moons? Well, when I think of the highest form of laws, I can only really think of the laws of fate or destiny because they're inescapable and absolute. And conveniently, we know for a fact that the first Descender is indeed the one behind Teyvat's current system of fate. So by that logic, we can assume that the Heavenly Principles and the system of fate must be the same thing. They are both laws issued by heaven that must be obeyed. This would make the Moon Sisters the enforcers or keepers of heaven's laws, while the first Descender takes up the role of the one issuing mandates that they turn into law, and those laws become Teyvat's rules of fate. Now, connecting the moons with the concept of fate is something that is very easy to do. The Song of the Welcome Moon event straight up says that the new moon will rise and spin the wheel of fate anew, and then we've got Crimson Moon Semblance, which calls the moon pale fate which weaves a mocking destiny, and then there's Zephos' Moonlight, which says, quote, "The three departed goddesses had long determined the hero's fate, even if they could not fathom it themselves." Seriously though, the list of moon fate connections is stupidly long, so in the interest of time, I'm gonna leave it there. But that does leave us with three moons that make up a system of fate that we call the Heavenly Principles, or the Laws of Heaven. Now, you might have caught on to a few choice words that were used in the excerpts that I pulled to link moons and fates together. You know, stuff like spinning and wheels and weaving. And those are all concepts that are associated with looms, which should make you think of the loom of fate. And that is why I would like to suggest that the moons were the original loom of fate. And there's a lot more than some interesting word choices to back this up. For example, if we look at this from a mythological perspective, a Greek one in particular, we'll discover a perfect parallel to our moon-themed fate goddesses, the Moirai. The Moirai were three women who spun, measured, and cut the threads of fate, and in some ways, they were considered to be more powerful than the gods themselves because they were basically the law. Not even the gods were free of fate's control. And if you ask me, that sounds like a pretty similar setup to what we have with the moons, especially if they are, in fact, the Heavenly Principles. Now, I do have to recognize that the Moirai were spinners and not weavers, but spun threads are meant to be woven, so if we think of the world as a woven fabric made up of individual lives in the form of spun threads of fate, then it is easy to reconcile this discrepancy, especially because in the Song of the Welcome Moon teaser, it straight up says that the moon goddesses caused the celestial sphere to spin, which means they're already spinning, and then they wove those feelings into the heart of the world. So they took the threads they spun and they wove them into the fabric that makes up the world. So the celestial sphere is like a spinning wheel and the moons are the loom. Let me clarify one thing really quick. I don't think the Moon Sisters are the moons themselves. I think we have more of a Nahida situation on our hands wherein like Nahida is not Irminsul but also just like an avatar of Irminsul. She's like a spirit or a god that watches over an independent system. I think the moons are basically like independent systems, somewhat like Irminsul, while the Moon Sisters are avatars of their respective moons. And if the moons specifically are the independent system of the laws of heaven, also known as the Heavenly Principles, then the avatars of the moons would be like the sustainer of the Heavenly Principles. You know, one of the entities that enforces the laws of heaven. which would make this unknown god here a moon sister, by the way. Now remember, I did differentiate between a moon and a moon sister, because I think what's going on is that the moon is a loom and the moon sister is like a weaver of the loom. Now we're gonna come back to this whole moon is a loom and the moon sister is a weaver thing a little bit later. But for now I wanna draw your attention to something that's a little bit odd about the Song of the Welkin Moon that also relates to the relationship between the moons and the first descender. Because see, the first descender is never mentioned alongside the moons. They're only ever mentioned alongside their shining shades. But timeline-wise, the first descender and the moons existed at the same time, and the moons were apparently subservient to the first descender, which means we have to ask ourselves the question, are the moons the shades of the first descender? So the first descender is named after the Gnostic deity called Phanes, as far as we know. And Phanes was said to have a body made entirely of light. Now, if we assume that all descenders that we have on record are the same type of life form, then we should look to the Traveler to figure out what kind of life form Phanes really was. The Traveler believes that they are a star, which would also mean that their body is made entirely of light, just like Phanes. So Phanes must be a star, or at least a manifestation of one. But a star with an orbiting planet is called a sun, and any moons that would be orbiting that planet would be reflecting the light of the sun. So the way I see it, the shade of the sun is easily interpreted as a moon. And these moons might be shining shades because they're reflecting the sun's light. And I've just remembered the fact that Deshret straight up calls the moons the shadows of the world in Staff of the Scarlet Sands. And he even implies that they help people find their final fate. Now, the most obvious issue with this idea is that there are only 3 moon goddesses, but there are 4 shades of the first descender. Now, I used to write this off as like, the 4th moon is technically the new moon, since you can't really see the new moon. And honestly, that would work in context of a Welkin moon, since in Chinese, Welkin is actually called a hollow moon, and the description of it talks about how it's the first new moon in Teyvat. And this moon teaser is called the Song of the Welkin Moon or the Song of the Hollow Moon, and it talks about how a new moon is rising. So we can argue for the existence of 4 moons in total. But it doesn't really account for the fact that we don't have a 4th fate or Morai to connect to a theoretical 4th moon. In the past, I have pointed to the mother of the 3 fates, who's Ananke, who also governed over fate, but I'm not entirely sure that still holds up here. We also don't really have a name for the 4th moon, you know? Like, we have the names of the 3 goddesses. They are Aria, Sonnet, and Canon, so the new moon is like a blank. But regardless of past me's loosey-goosey logic, I will point out that we do have a 4th moon. Like, the new moon, the Welkin moon, is technically a 4th moon, which does bring us up from 3 moons to 4 moons, and that equals it out for the whole 4 shades thing. I don't really know how to resolve the particulars around this on like timing-wise and who they are, how they were made, or whatever, but I'm sure there's gonna be a lore drop soon enough that'll explain everything. But on the topic of knowing names, of the 4 shades, we only know the names of 2, Renova and Istaroth. And both of those shades are named after the demons from the Lesser Key of Solomon, specifically Renove and Astaroth. And neither of those names have any connection to fate or moons or destiny or anything else that's seemingly relevant to this theory so far. However, we do know that Istaroth, at least, went by another name while she was in Enkanomiya. She went by the name of Kairos. Now, Kairos means the moment of opportunity and is connected to time and weather, which is very appropriate seeing as Istaroth is associated with both time and wind. But Kairos also has a place in the art of weaving, as it is the moment where the shuttle passes through the threads of a loom. So if Istaroth has a name that's related to the art of weaving and the moon goddesses are fate weavers, then this is pretty good evidence for Istaroth being a moon, or at least the shadow of a moon. Because here's the thing about the word shades. In the context of mythology, a shade is actually what you call the spirit or a ghost wandering around the underworld, especially in the Hebrew Bible and Greek mythology. Think of the sin shades that Istaroth left behind in Enkanomiya, for example. So when we talk about the crimson moon being a shadow of the iridescent moon that died, you gotta wonder if the 4 shades of the first descender are merely the spirits or ghosts of the defeated moon sisters. But what exactly do I mean by defeated moons? If the moons were subservient to the first descender, how, why, and when would the first descender have defeated them and turned them into shades? I'll tell you. It was during the Dragon War, because the moons are technically dragons. Let me explain. Let let me start things off with this mural that we see here in Dragonspine. Now, the civilization here, called Solvindignir, should have been around during the Unified Civilization. Why that era and not the Archon War? Because this mural has text on it that says, "The angels help the faithful," and we know that Seelies are confirmed to be angels. So if we use that text as context for the images here, we can assume that this figure here is a Seelie angel offering a gift to the little humans down here. So what does this have to do with dragons? Well, riddle me this. Why in the fresh heck does this Seelie look like Wahakalhoon Ubakan? I mean, the horns, robe, and even the shape of his jetpack looks just like the wings of this Seelie. Isn't that weird? Couple that with the fact that a lot of dragons seem to be based on sea creatures, especially sea slugs, and the ghosts of Seelies are literally based on a sea slug called a sea angel, and you have a steaming hot pile of sus. And I also think it's kind of odd that this Celestia in the mural with the moons in the background look oddly similar to the dragon islands that we see in Tulin. In fact, it's actually quite possible that the sky island we see in Tevat is a remnant from one of the shattered moons, and not a creation of or the palace of the first descender. In addition to this, at the end of the Natlan Archon quest, we learn from Mahuika that the secret source technology actually comes from the moon, which is interesting because secret source technology is also dragon technology. In fact, the iridescent inscriptions on the secret source mechanisms may be directly referencing the iridescent moon. Perhaps they both were computers that use the same programming language. Maybe that's what the iridescent inscriptions are. And now I would like to draw your attention to this symbol here. This symbol has been in the game since launch and was frequently interpreted as the symbol of an eclipse. But now we know that's not the case. It's actually a symbol of all three moons in alignment. Now, I would absolutely love to pick apart the real reason why this symbol appears behind Deshret in the desert ruins and pops up a few times in Liyue, but we're gonna save that from another time. For now, I want you to look at this mural in Ochkanatlan, which was originally a dragon city, because this mural appears to be a depiction of the Dragon King Nibelung straight up creating Tevat. But if you look closely, you'll notice that same moon symbol once again. 3 of them, actually. 3 moons that appear to be obeying Nibelung's will and helping him create or govern the world, which does imply the moons predated the first descender and would therefore be at their core draconic, the original tools or creations of Nibelung. Now here's the fun part. Genshin takes a ton of inspiration from the dramatic tale of Nibelungenlied, but they're particularly fond of Wagner's interpretation of it, the opera commonly called the Ring Cycle. Obvious connection is obvious. This myth is what Nibelung is named after. But the first part of the story is actually what I want you to pay attention to for right now. See, in the myth and in the opera, there's this magical river, and it's the Rhine River. And this Rhine River belongs to a god that we're gonna call the Rhine Father. We call him Father because he has daughters that live in the river, and yes, we will call them Rhine daughters because they are in fact the daughters of the river Rhine god. And if we think of Nibelung as the Rhine Father, then the 3 moon goddesses would be his Rhine daughters. This idea is not coming out of left field, I promise. Because see, Neuvillette calls Nibelung the Heavenly Father, and in tons of different mythologies, including those found in East Asia, the Milky Way is called the Heavenly River, and we could easily equate that to the Rhine River in this Nibelungenlied Dale. We'd have a literal river of stars in the sky, and the moons or the Rhine daughters would be swimming in that river of stars. Also, a friend of mine, Crystal Marie, pointed out that Tevat might not only be referencing Tevat Noah, or Noah's Ark, but might actually instead be based on the Estonian word for Tevatat, which means Sky Father, which would mean that the world is actually named after Nibelung, the Sky Father. Nibelung's world. Okay, but back to the opera. For reasons we don't need to get into right now because it's not that relevant, the Rhine Father leaves his river for a while and entrusts his daughters with the protection of his treasure, which is basically a hoard of magical gold. Now, one day, a dwarf named Elbrick comes and tries to woo the Rhine daughters, and when he gets snubbed, he steals the gold and forges it into a magic ring that basically makes him king. So basically what I'm saying is that Nibelung is the Rhine Father in this scenario, and the Moon Sisters are his Rhine daughters that is protecting his treasured gold, which is Tevat. The Rhine daughters do not succeed in protecting the gold, and so the gold in Tevat is stolen by Albric, who in this case would be the first descender. Which is really funny in the context of the rest of the theory, because the first descender is most likely also a reference to King Solomon, since all the gods in Tevat are named after demons, or rather fallen angels, and they are also listed in the Lesser Key of Solomon. And the Shades are no exception. In fact, Solomon was able to command and control these demons by seizing their true names using a magic ring. And heck, even the part about Albric trying to woo the Rhine daughters is relevant here because the Fall of the Moons was preceded by a legendary traveler from afar trying to marry a Seelie. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the first Ascender seized control of the Dragon Loom moons that governed the laws of Teyvat. That is how the moons were defeated and became shades. And actually, if you look at Crimson Moon's semblance, you'll find text that links the moons not just to fate, but also to vengeance, like the Great Dragon War of Vengeance against the first Ascender, who the weapon also implies the moons bowed their heads to. And there's another line that seems to equate the moons to shades of the Ashen Sun. Now I know this is mostly said in relation to Conria's shifting dynasties, but history likes to rhyme and repeat with itself, and Conria appears to have been founded as the result of the Great War of Vengeance that destroyed the moons, if the scribe's box in Dragonspine is anything to go by. So I think this could easily be evidence for a Dragon Moon Loom computer system that governs fate. Okay, I know I haven't really talked about why I think the moons are computers, and I know it's probably a little bit confusing to call them both computers and looms, but the truth is, computers and looms are a lot more alike than you'd think. Okay, so confession. I was actually gonna write this theory before the Moon teaser came out because I was super bothered by the fact that this Star Rail character has this theme of sewing and weaving, and she's also somehow the internet itself. Like, her golden threads cover this entire city, and it's literally called the World Wound Web. People connect their phones to it to communicate with each other. And I was sitting here like, why? Why does this seamstress provide internet access? How do you thematically connect sewing and computers? I don't understand. I know, I'm really bothered by stupid nitpicky things, but sometimes that's a really useful trait to have because in my frustration, I remembered something very important. The loom is the grandfather of the computer. No, I'm not kidding. Let me explain. So initially, if you wanted to weave a pattern on like a standard loom, you would have to weave the shuttle in and out and over and under all of the threads individually. It was very tedious and very time consuming, and it made woven patterned fabric extremely expensive. So in 1804, a man named Joseph Marie Jacquard had this idea for a semi-automatic loom that was based on the work of Basile Beauchamp's 1725 perforated paper tape loom. The idea is that he would be able to automate this process of weaving patterns. So Jacquard came up with an ingenious design. Each vertical thread, also known as a warp, were set above a set of hooks called knives. When the weaver stepped on the treadle, the knives would hook the warps and lift them up all at once so the weaver didn't have to raise each thread individually. This allowed them to swoosh the shuttle right through the threads in one swift motion, which drastically sped up the weaving process and reduced the presence of errors within the pattern. But obviously you don't really get patterns if you always lift all of the threads all at once. To get different patterns, you need to raise and lower the threads at different intervals. And this is where Jacquard's ingenious punch card carousel comes into play. And yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is literally a carousel of connected cards with holes punched in them. And it worked like this. For each time you had to pass the shuttle, a punch card would be pressed up against a set of pins that were connected to the knives. If there was no hole where the pin met the card, then the card would push the pin inward, which would push the knife backwards so it could not hook and therefore raise the thread. So basically, the weaver would step on the treadle, which would advance the punch card stack and place the next card against the pins, which changed which threads were raised and lowered, which technically resulted in a pattern that represents binary data, an elevated thread for a 1 and a lowered thread for a 0. That makes each row of a woven fabric a stripe of binary data. So it's easy to see how a punch card system from these looms inspired early calculators. Early tabulating machines like calculators literally used the same types of punch card systems to encode binary data, which makes punch cards one of the earliest manifestations of binary code that's still found in modern computers. And that is why that one character in Star Rail is a weaver who provides internet access with her threads. There is a literal, direct, historical link there. Did I ever mention that those same threads are called her threads of fate? No? Well, they are, and even when they aren't connecting their game worlds together, Hoyoverse sure likes to remix ideas, so who's to say this connection of looms, computers, and fate threads aren't present in Genshin too? All evidence so far seems to suggest that they are. So okay, we can reasonably connect looms to early computers, but why am I so sure that the moons are computers, or better yet, dragon computers? Couple reasons. First off, Irminsul on the inside is very digital. It's basically a computer. You can look at its avatar Nahida just to see that she's basically all these computer-human interfacing devices. Keyboards, mice, that kind of thing. Now, in The Legend of the Shattered Halberd, Irminsul is actually referred to as a lance that pierced the world, which makes it sound a lot like a void shuttle. Now, void shuttles are only mentioned in the Shuttle of Odara, which says that dragons may have possessed a device called a void shuttle, and then it proceeds to describe this void shuttle as a, quote, blazing javelin that could traverse the pitch black darkness between the stars. Now, you could interpret this as something like a space shuttle or rocket, but the Chinese characters used for shuttle are actually referring to the shuttle of a loom specifically, which means that the void shuttle was likely a tool of the moons who wove fate, and Irminsul might be a void shuttle because they're both described as spears or lances. Another point towards Dragon Moon looms. Although, Nahida's comment about her just being the moon, that might be literal, because if the moon is a loom, well, the Loom of Fate's job was to weave new ley lines, but ley lines are the roots of Irminsul, which means that Irminsul is connected to the current system of fate. So if Irminsul is a void shuttle, then that would make perfect sense, right? It would make Nahida related to a moon. Okay, second reason for the computer. Arlecchino bears the blood of the Crimson Moon dynasty, and also all the curses that come with that bloodline. And that curse seems to make her glitch out, like digitally. And if her bloodline is connected to the Crimson Moon's shadow, which is the shadow of the iridescent moon, then it makes sense if the moon is also digital in nature, right? She also has threads in her boss kit, which I think is fitting. Also, if the heavenly principles are fate and the moons control fate and the sustainer of heavenly principles is an avatar of the moon and the moon is like a computer loom, then it's noteworthy that the unknown god here has the same glitchy nature as Arlecchino. And now that I think about it, I wonder if the unknown god's cubes are related to Nahida's data storage cubes. No, I will not let myself be distracted by this. Nope, moving on. Third point, true dragons appear to be body agnostic. They're like spirits or consciousnesses that are capable of manifesting or possessing any form of their choosing made from any sort of material. Now, given their highly advanced technology, I don't necessarily think it's a stretch to say that true dragons may have turned themselves into some kind of digital consciousness. Ishlel is actually a pretty good example of this idea. She refers to herself as a dragon lord, which means she ranks pretty high. And she also introduces herself with a make and model number, like a machine or a piece of software. And along those same lines, Ahau is also considered a dragon lord, and he got trapped in a phlogiston device, which makes him capable of manifesting as a low-res pixelated phlogiston projection, at least until his contract with Kanich comes to an end so he can take over Kanich's body. And that brings me to point number 4. Seelies are beholden to the moons and have similar dragon-like body-agnostic tendencies, and they also like to possess mechanical devices like the secret source mechanisms in the Night Kingdom. The children of the Seelie, like the Jinn, also possess machinery fairly often. Ferengis possessed both the Waterways mechanism in Gurabad and the Guardian mechanism at the Eternal Oasis, for example. And the fragmented souls of the Jinn were also placed into tons of these desert constructs too. Technically, that was what led to the fall of Gurabad, but that's a story for another day. But the final point about the Moon Loom Dragon computer theory comes from Simulanka, which sounds weird, I know, like what does a book of fairy tales have to do with a Moon Loom Dragon computer? Well, for starters, the name Simulanka is a blend of the words simulation and Lanka, and the simulation aspect can be like a computer simulation, while Lanka refers to the Hindu island kingdom, which was guarded by 3 mountains. And, well, this mural sure makes Teyvat looks like some kind of island kingdom governed by 3 moons instead of mountains, but you get the idea, right? Now, Simulanka is supposed to be a mirror world to Teyvat, and just like its non-simulated counterpart, it also has its fate governed by 3 sisters, or witches, who are typically considered sisters to each other if they're in the same coven. Those sisters are Alice, Barbelith, and Anders' daughter. Anders' daughter chose the direction of the world's story, Barbelith set up the guardrails to ensure the story progressed as dictated, and Alice brought that story to life. If you look at their roles in the context of the Jacquard loom, then these roles make perfect sense when it comes to weaving fate. Anders' daughter would have been the one who painted the original pattern of the world on grid paper. She knew what every stitch would look like and marked it all down. Barbelith took this grid paper and translated it into the punch cards, which served as the guardrails the world's loom would use to weave fate. She basically locked in the pattern for Alice to follow because Alice, in this case, should be the weaver, the one who actually creates the fabric. And fittingly, the fates of the moons in Teyvat also seem to somewhat apply to the fates of the three witches. Like, both Ander's daughter and the iridescent moon are dead, and Barbelith and the frost moon both stopped turning. You know what I'm talking about, right? This whole music box? This music box with Barbelith's statue on it that makes the entire sky spin? The spinning celestial sphere that we see in the Welkin Moon teaser trailer thingy? Yeah, I literally think this was referring to the frost moon. A lore buddy of mine, Chalk, pointed this out to me. But what's even funnier about this to me is that music boxes also run on a binary system, just like a Loom's punch cards. Now, they don't technically use punch cards with holes in them, but they do have raised and lowered bumps where the hole punches should be. And Barbelith's music box is surrounded by what appears to be binary music box notation. To top it all off, the three moons originally had the names of aria, sonnet, and canon, which are names of different types of songs. So the binary music box computer loom of fate that weaves the stars into the fabric of destiny feels very appropriate right about now. Oh, and the cubic pillars over the castle town? They remind me of the knives of the Jacquard loom. So maybe this castle town is supposed to be Celestia. I don't know. And there is this one other thing. It doesn't really push the computer idea, but we did have that one side quest where the three witch statues on the island required 2 dragon artifacts, a scale and a horn, plus a ball of light, which could be a dragon pearl for all I know. And those 3 artifacts combined together to make a new moon. A new moon born of the relics of the first 3, just like the Song of the Welkin Moon teaser. Now, if you're not new here, you might recall that I like Wanderer a lot. So when I think about a new moon, I'm actually reminded of this fairy tale story in Inversion of Genesis, wherein he curses the moon, which is his mother, who is technically a machine also, by the way, and then he declares that he will become the new moon. And he's also a machine. He's a moon machine, a new moon machine. And he's also the hero of Simulanka, and he befriends a robot dragon that's literally pixelating this simulated world full of other mechanical men living in clockwork castles. And I do not know what that means for the hero of a Teyvat simulation to be a machine, but I'm sure as heck side-eyeing the crap out of it. Oh, but I'm not actually suggesting that Wanderer is the hero of Teyvat proper. It's more like Wanderer in Simulanka is an allegory for the real hero in Teyvat. Perhaps one who bears a similar name. You know, like, the Traveler, maybe. So if Wanderer is analogous to the Traveler, then is Durin the Dragon analogous to Paimon? There's a million more things I want to say about this theory, but in the interest of time, I'm gonna leave you with that. Also, mind, brain, hurdy, which means no more worky, so I'm gonna skedaddle. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Leave your thoughts down in the comments, because I'm very interested to see where you go with all these little threads that I've thrown your way. And hopefully I'll see you all in the next one. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.